From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And coming your way today from the Washburn University School of Law, Roger McEowen will provide more information on the stipulations of the Paycheck Protection Program loans. In as far as agricultural producer eligibility, there's been more clarification on that over the past week. Also today, K-State's Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz will talk about accounting for possible nitrogen losses from last fall's applications here at spring planting time. He says that in general, the likelihood of such losses is fairly low, but that some of you producers may want to check that out before too long regardless. And in later, with his weekly commentary on life in rural Kansas, K-State's Gus Vanderhoeven, plus much more, here on Agriculture Today.
For information on threatening weather, you should depend on the National Weather Service and their broadcast on NOAA Weather Radio. NOAA Weather Radio is an all-hazards radio network that provides up-to-the-minute weather information, including life-saving warnings anytime, day or night. NOAA Weather Radio also broadcasts information on man-made disasters, such as chemical spills, Amber Alerts, or other national emergencies. For the National Weather Service, I'm Bill Curtis.
You are tuned in to Agriculture Today. As always, we appreciate you listening in. As we are joined now by a professor of agricultural law and taxation at the Washburn University School of Law, Roger McEowen. Roger, we're going to conduct some follow-up and hopefully provide additional clarity about this opportunity for producers to take advantage of the Paycheck Protection Program loans that are coming out of the Small Business Administration. Last time we visited, there was quite some murkiness over all of this. There has been clarification since then, correct?
Yeah, that's right. Recent guidance just late last week, Eric, indicated that both SBA and Treasury now have clarified their documentation and the information they put out to make sure that it's clear that farming and ranching operations are eligible for the PPP. You're eligible if your business has 500 or fewer employees, and that's going to be most farming operations, or the business, and that's an or, the business has the average annual gross receipts of $1 million or less. Now, if you can't satisfy either of those tests, there's a third way to get in, and that is you can still qualify if your net worth of the business does not exceed $15 million and your average net income post-tax, excluding any carryover losses for the 2 full fiscal years before the date of the PPP application, does not exceed $5 million. And so those are your basic rules. They have clarified that agriculture is eligible for the PPP. There were some lenders that were telling farm borrowers that they weren't eligible. And that was clearly wrong. And finally, after about a 2-week delay and requesting them to get this information out, they finally did late last week.
But there is a finer point here that needs additional clarification as well. That is, the rules as they would apply to a self-employed agricultural producer. The PPP, by the title itself, indicates this is to be supportive of maintaining money going to employees of an operation or a business. But do self-employed farmers qualify here?
Yeah, that's an issue because one of the ways you can qualify is, of course, having qualified payroll. But if you're self-employed sole proprietor, you don't have payroll. So can you qualify? Well, technically, self-employed taxpayers became eligible for loans on April 10 of this month, earlier this month. And for a self-employed taxpayer, the loan amount is based on the taxpayer's net self-employment earnings, limited to $100,000 of net self-employment income. So the maximum loan, the way this is calculated to a self-employed taxpayer, is set at about 21%. It's just a little bit under that of self-employment earnings plus your other payroll costs. So if you're a Schedule C taxpayer, non-farmer, you're going to look at line 31 of your Schedule C, that's your net profit. And if that amount's over $100,000, then you're limited to $100,000. If it's a loss on line 31, then normally your loan amount's going to be zero, but you can take half of your employee payroll costs and add those in, so you would get that. Now, for 2019 Schedule F farmer, the applicable line on the F is line 34, and of course you're going to have to provide SBA with a copy of your 2019 return. Now, what happened last week, the position that SBA took was that if you show a loss on line 34 of the Schedule F, you don't qualify for any loan based on earnings, and you could only qualify for a loan based on your payroll costs. Well, again, if you're self-employed, you don't have employee payroll costs, so you're going to be cut out. And so they did clarify that farmers were eligible, but we don't like that detail of clarification with respect to self-employed farmers, because what they're doing, Eric, this was a rule change into the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in late 2017 that took effect for tax years beginning after 17. They changed the rules with the way we report income that might be triggered as a result of trading machinery, combines, tractors, those types of things. We used to route those through a Schedule F, so there might have been such things as income triggered by the trade. We might have cash boot that's thrown in. That would show up on an F, and some other things too. None of that goes through an F now. It all goes to a different form known as 4797, and that F may actually show a loss because of the way that the return is now worked as a result of the change in the law. And so you got all this income on a 4797, you don't have any income on the F, and you're going to not be eligible for a loan because they're not going to allow you to reconcile the 4797 with the F to get any of that income to count. I hope we can convince them in the coming days to change that position, but that's a tough position right now because a lot of farmers in recent years have shown a Schedule F loss, but have shown income on a 4797.
So there is dialogue going on about that potential change.
That's right.
That might come together, but stay tuned, as they say. What about how the rules work for farm partnerships? This was another semi-unknown the last time we talked.
Right. We got a little bit more guidance on this one, although still there are unanswered questions. But for partnerships, we know that filing is at the partnership level. So that precludes each partner from receiving a loan. The partnership gets the loan. But the law is unclear whether income is based on guaranteed payments to partners or partnership gross receipts. In other words, the statute is unclear is what I mean by that. But late last week, SBA came out with their interpretation on this, and they said a partnership can count for purposes of the amount of the loan it can receive all employee payroll costs. In addition, the partnership can count all self-employment income of partners computed as the total self-employment income that shows up on line 14A of the Schedule K or the K1. Then you reduce that amount by any expense method depreciation deduction that's claimed, any unreimbursed partnership expenses that were claimed, and depletion claimed on oil and gas properties, which might be an issue in Kansas, although it's not a big issue nationwide. Then you take that result and multiply it by 92.35% to get your net self-employment earnings. If that final amount's over $100,000, you're limited to $100,000. You're going to reduce it to $100,000. Now, if we're dealing with a Schedule F farmer, say a self-employed farmer instead of somebody that's in a partnership, do you have to multiply that result out of that formula by 92.35%? I don't think so, but I hope we see some clarification of that in some future announcement down the road, because the same calculations usually apply to Schedule C and Schedule F filers on a Schedule SE. So that's one thing that we don't know yet.
Here's a question that has become more prevalent of late, and if one is successful as a producer in acquiring a Paycheck Protection Program loan, would that then make that individual ineligible for the other aid that's coming out of the coronavirus 19 circumstances, the agricultural part that the USDA is working on right now?
No, there's no basis for that position in the statute. This is something that came up last week. My email was blown up. My phone was blown up with farmers calling me, telling me, and other tax professionals calling me saying they've got clients that are raising this question because lenders were telling them, well, if you receive a PPP loan, that's going to make you ineligible for the ag part of the CARES Act food assistance program. It's also going to eliminate or diminish your USDA subsidies. Neither of those comments by lenders is correct. Now, it's not every lender that's saying this, but apparently a significant number of them across the country were taking that position. There is no authority for that in the statute, and there's no regulatory body such as SBA or the Treasury that has taken that position. Not sure where it came from. It may have stemmed from the lack of guidance initially by SBA to clarify that agriculture was eligible. But other than that, no, it's not going to have any impact on the other ag portions of the CARES Act food assistance program. It's not going to have an impact on USDA subsidies.
It's nice to hear something that's definitive amidst all of this. So as one would hear and read more about the PPP, the loan availability there, with the coffers replenished for that program recently, and we'll see how long the money lasts, what do you want producers to take away from all of this?
Well, again, I think it's good to reiterate how deep in the weeds you can get on this. This is a tough slog, and I'm sure it's tough for people to listen to our conversation here, but hopefully they get a couple of good points out of this. I think a good take-home is get professional help. Do not try to fill out these forms on your own. This is incredibly complex. You're going to have detailed tax information to provide a lender. When you make application for the loan, you're going to have your paperwork in place. And I say that to say this. I think SBA may audit the requirements that taxpayers certified, both that there was economic uncertainty and that the funds were actually needed in order to keep employees on the payroll and paid during the period February 15 this year through the end of June. If you're a farmer with sufficient liquidity that's not poised to shut down, and being able to establish that the funds were needed for payroll purposes could be pretty difficult to establish. And I think that could be particularly true for grain farmers and others that are currently planting crops and have their lines of credit already available to them, and they have an adequate percent of their crop insured and have the ability to pay their employees. Now, for dairy and livestock and produce operations, I think it's going to be easier to satisfy the payroll requirement. In other words, I need the loan to keep my payroll going. But clearly, you need documentation for the loan, and that's going to be critical to maintain, as is documentation after the end of that 8-week loan forgiveness period on the back end. I think that's the big takeaway out of this.
Well, the winds have been swirling around this Paycheck Protection Loan Program out of the Small Business Administration. And Roger, of course, has been good to keep the latest on this out in front of you, producers, via the blog he maintains. So use that resource, washburnlaw.edu/WALTR. And yeoman work in staying on top of this, as challenging as it is. Roger, many thanks, and in a couple of weeks we'll talk again.
Thank you, Rick.
Our regular visit with Roger McEowen, Professor of Agricultural Law and Taxation at the Washburn University School of Law. We'll be back with more on Agriculture Today.
A social distancing tip.
Keeping your distance from others is important in slowing the spread of coronavirus. So here are some fun things to do alone. Read a book, take a walk, unpack your suitcase from that trip you took last September, paint a self-portrait, catch up on a TV series, do a puzzle. Remember, we should all stay home to lower the risk for everyone. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
We are back now on Agriculture Today with our subject here in the area of crop nutrient management, as along with us once more is crop nutrient specialist with K-State Research and Extension, Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz. This time, Dorivar will address the possibility of nitrogen losses from applications that row crop producers may have put down this past fall, and what could contribute to those losses, and if those losses are in fact likely. But just noting here that fall applied N has become quite popular with row crop producers as a standard nutrient management practice.
Yes, Eric, and this is always a common question. You know, if we're doing most of the nitrogen apply in the fall using anhydrous, then the question is, as we are moving into corn planting now and the rest of the season, do we still have that nitrogen there, and do we have any risk of nitrogen losses that maybe happen during the winter? And so that's one big question. And typically there's a few things that we need to keep an eye on when it comes to the potential risks associated with nitrogen losses during the winter times. And we have to keep in mind that nitrogen loss really happen when you have nitrogen in the nitrate. So obviously when you are injecting anhydrous, that nitrogen is in the ammonium form. That tends to be pretty stable in the soil, usually will not go anywhere. But then we do have microbial activity taking over and converting, basically changing this ammonium into nitrate. And once it's in the nitrate form, that's really the form of nitrogen that may be lost either by leaching or denitrification, the typical loss processes that we have in the soil. So that's one key factor. And like I mentioned, this is a microbial-driven process, which means we have a couple key factors here that's going to be driving this process. One of them is temperature, and the other one is the presence of oxygen. So the microbes basically need oxygen and warmer temperatures for this to happen. So one thing that I often do is I kind of like to monitor the soil temperature during the winter time. And this is something that information we can get actually from our K-State Mesonet network that monitors soil temperature. And just looking at temperatures since November of last fall until just a few days ago, we're just getting to the point now that most of the soil temperature is getting above 50 degrees. Mm-hmm. And so typically that's the temperature that kind of the threshold that we tend to look for when it comes to microbial activity. So once that temperature goes above 50 degrees, you start to see more microbial activity. And obviously, we're going to start to see more conversion of that ammonium into nitrate. Now, looking again, pretty much the entire winter months, we did have temperatures pretty consistently below 50 degrees. So in general, we did have a winter that will be conducive to maintaining most of that nitrogen in the ammonium form. And so again, I wouldn't expect that we have any measurable amount of nitrogen losses during the winter months. And again, the question will be from now on, what's going to be that risk? And we really need to be watching moving forward now. What's going to be the risk potential associated with nitrogen losses. But again, from last fall until now, I would say chances of losing that nitrogen was very minimum, if any, given the conditions we had last winter.
Corn planting is underway in Kansas. Maybe this question of potential nitrogen losses becomes more critical, Dorivar, for those who will not be seeding their crop until some weeks on down the line, thinking directly here about grain sorghum, which won't be sown for another month or so in many cases. So could it be that we would see nitrogen losses that make a difference between, say, now and that grain sorghum planting time?
Yes, that's one key factor. Sorghum we're planting later, and that's usually a situation where fall apply anhydrous for grain sorghum, we tend to see a little bit more risk because, again, we just have a lot more time between that nitrogen application and the time that we are planting that sorghum and obviously the nitrogen uptake happening in sorghum. Also thinking a little bit about going back to corn, moving forward now, again, like I say, in my opinion, we'll probably have very limited losses in most of our soils this winter, but now we're going to start to see this microbial activity taking place. And typically, I would say in most of our conditions, time frame where we tend to see a lot of the nitrogen losses happening is in around June, when we have higher soil temperature and we have more rainfall. And so that's one thing that we need to watch very closely. Last year, for example, the 2019 growing season, I would say that's probably what happens in most of our situations, most of our fields. We did have some level of nitrogen losses, and I would say a lot of that happens in the June, July timeframe with the heavy rains that we have. So what are the options we have? And again, I know many producers is doing more and more split apply nitrogen. Some people may be doing part of the nitrogen applies, hydrous, either fall or spring application, and then maybe come back later in the season and put another shot of nitrogen. And that's obviously a good option, especially for those situations where we know we do have a little bit higher risk of nitrogen losses, maybe more rainfall, sandy soils, or also heavy clay soils where maybe we will have some level of denitrification later in the summer. And this is also something to think about. We talked a little bit about leaching, but the other nitrogen loss potential is denitrification. And for this to happen, we also need to have nitrate. So that's something to keep in mind. But we also need to have much higher temperature and water standing in the field for this process to take place. And so denitrification typically is something that's going to happen in the middle of the summer when we have soil temperatures getting to about 75 degrees in that range. That's where we usually going to have higher risk of denitrification losses. So again, typically not an issue early in the spring because soil temperature is still not that warm. We really need to have a higher soil temperature later in the season.
In the case, though, Dorivar, where a grower does suspect that they have lost some nitrogen out there from this point forward into the early summer and maybe beyond, they need to have an idea of how much N to apply to compensate for those losses, and that would require them to, sensibly enough, conduct a soil test to get a read on that, would it not?
Yes, that's definitely an option. We do also have more options nowadays in terms of using sensors, for example, in season that can help us to verify if we do have some nitrogen stress out there. So even including active sensors and satellites, obviously tissue testing becoming also more popular. So those are many options that we have really to evaluate and assess the situation in season. And like I mentioned earlier, I know more producers are considering just a standard practice to basically do more of a split application, leave some of that nitrogen for later in the season to make sure they provide nitrogen if we have any losses, but also minimize the potential risk of losing that nitrogen by splitting that nitrogen and putting it where the corn really need it. Obviously, we tend to improve efficiency quite a bit, especially in some soils, again, that would tend to be more susceptible to nitrogen losses. And I think that's the key here. We do have many soils in Kansas that split application will not necessarily result in yield benefits because, again, there may not be in high risk of nitrogen losses. But we also do have some soils, especially eastern part of the state, where the risk of nitrogen losses every year tends to be higher. And split apply nitrogen practice may be the most efficient approach in that kind of situation.
All of that considered, though, looking at briefly the economics of corn production right now, prices are not great. So one has to be somewhat precise in what they do with these follow-up end applications if they're necessary, do they not?
Absolutely, Eric, and that's the key point here. We have to keep in mind the cost of application and what is the strategy that we are using basically to maximize nitrogen use in this case. But definitely at the end of the day, the economics will be the key component here.
Well, there's information through the K-State Agronomy Department website to help you producers sort through the potential, again, for nitrogen losses coming out of those fall applications. And as soil temperatures warm up, whether that potential starts to increase as well. An article in the E-Update newsletter dated April the 17th covers this in some detail as well. You might want to check that out at agronomy.ksu.edu. Dorivar, we always appreciate the input. Take care. We will talk more about crop nutrient management not too long from now. Many thanks.
Thank you.
That from Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz, crop nutrient specialist, K-State Research and Extension. And to remind once again, yes, the K-State Soil Testing and Plant Disease Diagnostic Laboratories on the Manhattan campus are open for business and accepting samples. However, because of the COVID-19 protocol, submission of those samples has been modified to accommodate the distancing guidelines. No in-person sample deliveries to the laboratory. Those samples, though, can be left off at a drop box located on the northwest side of Throckmorton Hall on the campus if you happen to be in or near Manhattan. Samples can also be mailed into the lab via the Postal Service or UPS, or the procedure that many follow, submit those samples through your local extension office. The good folks there will take care of forwarding the samples to the lab for you. Contact your local office for sample bags, instructions, and with any questions you might have. Now we'll stand aside for a few moments, and when we come back, we'll have today's lead stories from the agricultural news page for you. And again, standing by with this week's Stop, Look, and Listen, K-State's Gus Vander Hoeven. So please stay with us. This is Agriculture Today.
Agriculture and food systems are the main drivers of the Kansas economy, but must be improved in order to feed the world's growing population. How are we going to do so? Reduce food loss, find ways to preserve grasslands, and help families stretch their dollars. Global food systems is one of the 5 grand challenges K-State Research and Extension is addressing. To learn more, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
You're tuned in to the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. Welcome back. Eric Atkinson here as we move on now to today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. Well, livestock producers will be able to continue moving animals through the processing stages under the executive order signed late yesterday by President Trump. That order effectively assures state and local officials cannot shut down a packing plant if it is following the worker safety guidelines issued over the weekend by the Centers for Disease Control and the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. The president used the Defense Production Act to deem packing plants as critical infrastructure for the nation to protect the food supply. Throughout April, at least 20 packing plants around the country have been forced to idle or drastically reduce capacity because of the growing worker illnesses. Those plants included those in Colorado, South Dakota, Iowa, and Minnesota, each of which account for 5% of processing capacity in the pork or beef industries. The Smithfield plant in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, became one of the nation's hot spots for cases earlier in the month, forcing Smithfield to close the plant back on Easter. That plant has now been linked to at least 850 cases. The high volume of worker infections caused packers to close plants across the Midwest and Southeast, especially as state and local officials raised alarms over the volume of worker-related cases. As of yesterday, cattle slaughter was down 31% and pork slaughter down 32%. Now, the situation, especially in the hog industry, has led to mass euthanasia strategies for hog producers. Officials in Minnesota have set up with a closed JBS plant in Worthington, Minnesota, to euthanize as many as 13,000 hogs a day. Groups representing meat packers, the chicken industry, and cattle producers late yesterday praised the president's order for ensuring plants will remain open or will reopen quickly. The CEO of the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, Colin Woodall, said that reopening plants will reduce the economic damage being inflicted on cattle producers who've been unable to ship cattle or have them processed because of the supply chain disruptions. And the North American Meat Institute, which has been largely quiet throughout the growing number of plant closures and worker infections, issued a statement thanking the president as well. That institute added the packing industry has and will continue to implement the Centers for Disease Control and OSHA guidance released on Sunday. By the way, those practices include testing, temperature checks, face covering, social distancing of employees where possible, and other measures. OSHA yesterday issued a statement citing enforcement guidelines that the agency will use for employers. Plants should conduct worksite assessments and adhere to the guidelines as much as possible, as well as document specific reasons why a measure is not feasible. OSHA also noted the Trump administration would support packers in court that are adhering to the OSHA-CDC joint guidance. Meanwhile, Iowa Republican lawmakers, including that state's governor and agricultural commissioner, are calling on the USDA to compensate hog producers for animals they have to euthanize. And a group of Minnesota state lawmakers also sent a letter to the president asking for him to direct the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention to coordinate the efforts, develop plans to reopen processing plants, and to work with smaller processors to get license exemptions to ensure as many hogs as possible can be processed. Well, pressure is mounting on President Trump to change the renewable fuel standard in light of the economic downturn brought on by COVID-19. A number of tax, environmental, and political think tanks sent a letter to the president yesterday asking him to make changes to the law. In recent weeks, governors in 5 states and the mayors of 2 cities in Ohio made similar requests, citing increased RFS costs imposed on the oil and gasoline sectors. The ethanol industry, however, has idled more than 70 plants in response to the cratering demand for gasoline. Quoting here the groups in their letter, inaccurate projections from 2005 to 2007, an inconsistent annual standard setting and waiver process, and congressional inaction punctuated by agency infighting underscores the need for repeal of the program, again in the group's words. That letter was signed by 24 groups, including the Americans for Prosperity, the American Energy Alliance, the Citizens Against Government Waste, the Heartland Institute, and others. The groups are asking the president to revisit the recently approved 2020 RFS volumes and direct the EPA to build upon recent waivers to ensure the availability of gasoline by waiving those biofuel requirements for the remainder of 2020. Now, the president and CEO of the Renewable Fuels Association, Jeff Cooper, responded by saying that the RFS already has built-in flexibility to adjust to market conditions. And Emily Score, the CEO of Growth Energy, said the oil and gasoline sectors already are being aided by the Trump administration. Congress has approved emergency relief legislation that would deliver additional funding for that Paycheck Protection Program, which we spoke of earlier with Roger McEowen, also approving the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program. Scarlett Higgins tells us here the bill also includes authorizing language to allow agricultural operations to qualify for that disaster loan program for the first time.
Prior to this legislation, agricultural enterprises did not have access to the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program, which offers loans of up to $2 million that can be used to pay fixed debts, payroll, accounts payable, and other bills. Funds cannot be used to refinance long-term debt, expand facilities, pay dividends or bonuses, or for relocation. If an applicant is a major source of employment, the Small Business Administration, which administers the program, may waive the statutory limit. Interest rates for the program are determined by formulas established in law and are fixed for the life of the loan. However, ceilings are statutorily set at no more than 4% per year. These loans are offered with long-term repayments up to a maximum of 30 years. Terms are determined on a case-by-case basis based upon each borrower's ability to repay. Once details of this legislation are finalized, producers can apply for an economic injury disaster loan advance of up to $10,000, which will not have to be repaid. As with the Paycheck Protection Program, loans provided through the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program will be available on a first-come, first-served basis to those with 500 or less employees. Those wanting to apply for either program should do so as soon as possible by contacting their lender. I'm Scarlett Higgins.
And those are the lead stories from today's agricultural news page. You're listening to Agriculture Today, and we'll return with more after you hear this. This is the K-State Radio Network.
Social distancing slows the spread of coronavirus, so stay a minimum of 6 feet away from others and stay home if you can. More info at coronavirus.gov. Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Stop, look, and listen.
I will not have grown for nothing.
That's Gus Vanderhoeven of Kansas State University, with comment on life in rural Kansas.
Just before the coronavirus struck, we had friends from Florida visiting us. They were making their annual trip to Manhattan and beyond. It was good to see them and have the afternoon to catch up. There never is enough time, but they had more old friends to see, so we waved goodbye. A few weeks later, we received a card with a few photos taken while here. The card was a gift card from the Arbor Day Foundation. I'm familiar with the foundation. In 2003, I received the Frederick Law Olmsted Award, given annually to a selected individual. I treasure it, as it does mean a lot to me. Generally, I'm not an award person. I don't care. Let the work speak for itself. But at one, I hung up so I can see it. I hold the greatest respect for Frederick Law Olmsted, the landscape architect of the Central Park of New York and many other projects. He put the profession of landscape architecture on the map, so to speak. The gift card addressed to Anneke, my wife, and me stated that a tree is being planted as a gift for you. The tree to be planted in one of our national forests. It continues with, your tree, a gift that endures, will help replenish a magnificent forest and preserves the habitat of the wildlife that call it home. One tree does not a forest make. The Louis Vuitton elm tree was an exception, but sadly, that tree was vandalized by some youth who should have known better. But that's another story I talked about many years ago. Just think about it. Anneke and I have a tree planted in one of our national forests, and it doesn't say where nor what kind of tree. Being a national forest and not a national park, I assume it will be a production tree. In other words, someday, a long time from now, the tree will be harvested. I have no problem with that. Until that day, it will be doing its job, helping to clean the air, storing carbon, and providing a perch. Might even be a bear scratches the bark, and thousands of insects will call it home. And then, what goes on about in the ground? The fact that I won't be around does not matter. I won't even know which trees and where it stands. I assume if I persisted, a forester would gladly point to a tree and say, that one is yours. And I would have to take his word for it. But that's not the point. It's a tree in a forest. We are part of a forest, a community of trees, a national forest. There are no national forests in Kansas. We are prairie, wide, open land. But could it be Alaska, in the Tongass National Forest? There are grizzly bears. It's the gateway to Canadian hinterland and Yukon, the Trail of 98, the gold mines. Could it be planted in the Kaibab National Forest in Arizona? What about Shasta National Forest? I've looked at Mount Shasta, with its wide snow cap, and I wondered. But maybe I'm planted back in Appalachia. It's fine. I'm sure that I will be planted properly and I will be cared for. What interests me is what kind of tree will I be? Of course, what tree I will be depends on where I am planted. While I'm growing, I will help control erosion. I will help to clean the air. I'll be home to life. But once I'm harvested, assuming I have survived wildfires and other catastrophes, what will happen to me then? I won't be firewood. Maybe some camper will take some of my dropped branches and cook his trout over my flames. And mind you, they are my wife's flames too. For all I know, I might become pulpwood. If I am to be pulpwood, I hope that whatever is printed on me is the truth and worthwhile reading. If it is going to be a book, let it be a good read. But there are so many other uses for wood, depending what tree I am. I may be one in construction, framing for a house. Let it be a well-built house, providing a home, a happy home. I might be used for furniture, fine furniture, well-designed and comfortable to sit in or to lay on. I could become a love seat. Years ago, I had a big oak tree which had fallen in the creek. It would block the water flow if ever the creek ran high. I sold the tree to a local sawmill. He came down with the dozer and eased down the creek. After cutting off all branches, he pulled the mighty log up out of the creek and hauled it home, where he carefully cut the log into planks. When we met later, he told me the wood was curing. Once cured, it would go overseas to be used for antique furniture repair. Hallelujah. Now that is a way to live on forever, whatever forever means. I can settle for that. Oh, there are so many trees to choose from. Might I be one of the firs? Could I grow into the tree they make violins or cellos from? I'm not asking, but if I could become part of a cello and be played at a concert or just give someone the joy of playing and making music for him or herself. The violin would or could be an issue, as I was encouraged as a child to learn to play the violin. I was 10 or 11 years old, and I hated it. I wanted to go outside. Yet, I had to practice the violin. The funny part was, I could play the popular tunes of that time. but refused to read a note. Okay, if my wood goes to a violin or dulcimer, let it be of a mountaineer, sitting on his front porch with his coonhound at his tilted chair. Let a dog howl in the moonlight. I will not have grown for nothing.
Gus Vander Hoeven of Kansas State University. That closes out our Wednesday edition. Thanks to you for being along with us. Eric Atkinson here for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.